All right, so I'm pretty sure that everyone envies me right now. Was, like, man, I wish I was that guy getting to respond to this. This is tough for all kinds of reasons that I think you are aware of, and I might have eaten the clicker. I don't remember eating it, but maybe I did. You see it around there, maybe underneath that hot coffee that I should have brought up here. There it is. I didn't eat it after all. All right. That's good. It's been hard to digest. All right. So here's what I want to do. We have the question, why is God so strict on marriage, divorce, and remarriage? And, in some ways it's kind of tough. It's kind of like asking, why did God command this? Or why did God ask us to do that? Or, and at any time in those living in the Bible, they could have raised some questions. Kind of like Naaman. Naaman's like, you're asking me to dip in the Jordan 7 times. And maybe he goes, why am I doing? What is the deal, But having said that, I think that we can approach an answer to this question. That we can have something to kind of chew on and to think about relative to, why God takes this so seriously. Okay? Here's what I want to do, at least want to try to establish, is first, I think, obviously the question, why is God so strict on marriage, divorce, remarriage? That implies that the person asking the question looks at this and goes, man, he seems really strict on this. Why is he, right? Like they have an understanding. But I think it's important for us, especially for others that might be tuning in, who may have some questions. Some people might be, why is he? I didn't think he was all that strict, or they might have some questions about why this question's even being asked. So I do want to spend a little time with Jesus in Matthew 19, and then I want to entertain reasons or look at maybe where we can go to get an idea of why God teaches what he teaches on this subject. And then I want to close with some questions that I think bring to the forefront some central concerns for us in this discussion. Some of these are going to go a little bit beyond the question that's being asked, but I think they're all really important for us to consider relative to the question here. All right, so let's think about Matthew 19, and boy, we're gonna have to really go through this fairly quickly. And I apologize if along the way I leave some holes or leave you asking questions, and that's fine. You can call me, right? We can talk, we can chat, we can dialogue, we can text back and forth or email, whatever. But here is the setting for this particular discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So here is the setting for the upcoming discussion about divorce, or we might say the reasons or causes for divorce between the Pharisees and Jesus. And this seems a little unrevealing at first, but I think we need to remind ourselves who ruled in the territory in which Jesus is ministering to people at this point in time. So I've kind of circled there for you the area that Jesus was at when he had this little confrontation with the Pharisees, and it's an area known as Perea. Now here's why I find this a little fascinating. The ruler over this area, not to mention Galilee, was Herod Antipas. Now he divorced his first wife, okay? And he had married her early on in his reign. But then he came to favor Herodias, who had formerly been married to his half-brother Philip. So what happened is, on a visit to Rome, Herod stayed with his half-brother Philip. He's a married man, mind you. Philip's a married man, and Herod's a married man. And there he fell in love. Herod fell in love with his half-brother's wife, Herodias. So they agreed to marry. I guess she fell in love with him, or whatever the case may be. And they secured divorces. And in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, we find these words about Herodias. Herodias took upon her to confound the laws of our country and divorce herself from her husband while he was still alive, and was married to Herod, her husband's brother by the father's side. Now, I think many of you, those of you who are good Bible students and have read through your Gospels, you know that sometime after Herod Antipas and Herodias were married, a man by the name of John the Baptist came to town. And he was preaching and he was baptizing people in the Jordan River, which is situated along the western edge of Herod Antipas' territory. John criticized, he criticized this marriage. And he said to Herod on several occasions, Mark 6:18, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So it not be so." Herod's and Herodias' divorces and subsequent marriage violated, the law. It offended many Jews, maybe not all, but many of them. Mark 6:21-29 recounts the occasion when Herodias was able to procure John the Baptist's head on a platter. Now, why was that precipitated? Because John the Baptist kept saying, "You guys ought not be married." Now today, preachers in America don't have to worry about being beheaded for upholding God's teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But they still have to endure getting their head bitten off from time to time, right? They still have to endure that, and usually that's for nothing more than just trying to honor what we find in this passage and parallel passages. So we get into Matthew 19:3. Pharisees came up to Jesus and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" I think you need to pay attention to that motive here. They tested him. Okay? I think they're looking to get him in trouble. And they could have got him in trouble a couple of ways. What do you think most men would prefer? A stringent view of divorce and remarriage, or a divorce for any cause? And then, secondly, what if you get Jesus to say, in the territory of Herod Antipas, that you can't just divorce your wife for any cause and marry somebody else? This could be a threat to Jesus' life, potentially. Well, they tested him. Shows that they're trying to push Jesus into saying something that might damage his credibility with the people or something like that. The question probably presupposes the Jewish cultural situation where only a man could initiate divorce proceedings. But let's be sure we understand that both Jesus in Mark 10:12 and Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:13 foresee the possibility of the wife initiating the divorce. You see how this is worded? Is it lawful to divorce one's wife? Well, some people are like, well, the wife couldn't do the divorce, and let's be careful there. Okay? But it is sort of presupposing what was kind of the norm in Jewish culture. And notice it's not about divorce per se, it's about the reasons or the cause for divorce. Can a man divorce his wife for any cause? That's what Jesus is after. But I think we need to interject a little something here. This goes back into the law. This is Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1. And what I want us to notice is the particular phrase that caused strong disagreement among the Jews in Jesus' day. Strong disagreement. And that's that little phrase, because he has found some indecency. Now, literally, that comes out a thing of nakedness. And here's what you need to know. There were two sort of rival rabbinic schools in Jesus' day. There was Rabbi Hillel and there was Rabbi Shammai. All right? Shammai, he really focused on the word nakedness there. And so for him, a divorce could only take place if there was some sort of unchastity or some sort of, let's say, sexual situation that might have, lewdness that might have precipitated a divorce here. Hillel focused on the word thing. And he was the one that championed the idea that you could divorce your wife for any reason. So, ladies, if you burn the biscuits, your husband can be like, it's over, okay? And write you a bill of divorce, okay? We'll come back to that. There was, in fact, another guy. His name was Rabbi Akiba. His is interesting because there is in the passage, if she finds no favor in his eyes, is something that is reported here. You'll see that. He looked at that and said, well, you can divorce your wife if you happen to come across a woman that you believe is prettier than your wife. And you're like, you know what? I thought my wife was pretty, but this woman appears to be prettier to me, and so I will get rid of my pretty wife for the prettier wife. Y'all see what they're trying to embroil Jesus in now? And what do you think now, let me just ask you, you guys are smart people. Of Hillel and Shammai, which do you think was championed by most Jewish men? Divorce for any cause, or, you know, something a bit more specific? Well, you know, Hillel, divorce for any cause. Now, that was popular. What if Jesus doesn't go along with how's he going to get out of this? Now, let me just tell you, it's always a mistake to wrangle with Jesus. Last time I checked, he's the Son of God, and he will beat you every time. Right? So, because I established that last, right? I established that in the last lesson. He's the Son of God, so I wouldn't mess with him. So here we go. We get into this part. Here's how Jesus is going to respond to that. Jesus, going to go back to the beginning. File that away in your brains. Jesus answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So the Pharisees were kind of, they were trying to reason, from Deuteronomy. Jesus is going to go back to Genesis. All right? And his reply is kind of threefold here. First, Jesus goes back beyond Deuteronomy 24 to God's original intention for marriage when he created man and woman. He alludes to Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 5:2 in order to emphasize the fact that God created only one person of each sex, which demonstrates that the two were made for each other exclusively. God didn't give Adam 10 wives. He gave him only one. And God thus established the basic unity of society in which each person would possess one partner of the opposite sex. Secondly, in quoting Genesis 2:24, Jesus shows that the bond between the two lies in the nature of God's creative act. In bringing the man and woman together, God unites them in one flesh. And divorce is a violation of God's will in this matter because it severs the unity of God's creative act. Third, Jesus urges all men to respect God's intent for the marriage bond. He says, let not man separate what God has joined together. A way I like to put this, it's kind of cute. You ready? Don't unone what God has made one. All right? Is that not what Jesus is saying here? Don't unone what God has made one. And I like this because, Jesus is demanding, right, that the Jews stop ignoring God's teaching about marriage from the beginning. And this high view that Jesus is getting into here, honestly, would have been quite revolutionary. Although it really shouldn't have been, but boy, this is cutting against the grain a little bit. R.T. France, in his commentary on this passage, expressed it like this. He said, "To see divorce as man undoing the work of God puts the whole issue in a radically new perspective." Now, I'll just let that settle in. God's brought them together into one flesh. Let not man do what? Separate that. Don't let him unwind that. That's what God desires. Then we get to Matthew 19:7. Here the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" All right, so here's what they're doing. If what you're saying is true, Jesus, then aren't you going against Moses? And I can tell you right now, if you go against Moses, my buddies aren't going to like that too much, right? Nobody, in fact, is going to like that. You can't go against Moses. This is where we're going to go back to that Deuteronomy 24 passage. There's a lot going on here. This is something a lot of people don't understand, or they just haven't taken the time to see this. And Jesus is going to confirm this. What we have here really is not a command. You know, it was an eternal command. It was a merciful concession. And what's fascinating to me, in some ways, this was instituted in order to get a man to think long and hard before he writes a bill of divorcement. And it would appear that a lot of folks were disrespecting God's intention for marriage during this time. And God, because of the hardness of heart, this is what Jesus is going to say in just a second, allowed, permitted, okay? Notice he doesn't use the word commanded, like this is for heretofore, okay? He allowed this. And notice, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. And she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, notice this, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. Do you see what he just said here? He said this, if you give her a bill of divorcement, Mr. Jewish man, and she leaves, she's gone forever. You don't ever get to be with her again. You don't ever get to enter into a relationship with her again. So you need to think long and hard before you just hand your little bill of divorcement out there. So Jesus, he comes back and he says, now why did Moses do this? He goes, because of the hardness of your heart, right? Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But what does Jesus keep doing? Y'all got to see this. He keeps going back to the beginning. He's real stubborn like this, right? He's going to take them back to the beginning. And he says, from the beginning, it was not so. And we know that's true because he just quoted what the beginning was all about. I put this in here just to kind of show you some responses here. But we know that these two passages that parallel Matthew 19, 1 through 9 underscore God's ideal at creation. And what I need you to see, neither one of these passages include the exception we're about to look at in verse 9. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Do y'all see any exceptions in that? There's not. Imagine if that was the only thing that was in your Bible. Let me ask you a question. This is a good one, I think. Do you think God would have had the right to put that there and just leave it at that? Like, couldn't God have said, this is such a big deal that if the marriage relationship between you and another person that I brought into a one flesh relationship, that if it ends in divorce for whatever reason, it's over. You cannot be joined to somebody else because I joined you to that person. And that's what that passage would have basically said, right? And here's another one. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. There's not an exception in that. It's just straight up. If you divorce your wife and you go and marry another, commit adultery. That's just all it says. Well, we move on and we get to Matthew 19:9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. This is the battleground verse, right? With the words, and I say to you, Jesus is contrasting the concession made in Deuteronomy 24 and Jewish interpretations of it with his own teaching. And a straightforward reading of the text yields the conclusion that Jesus upheld one reason or cause for divorce that could then result in a subsequent remarriage for the injured party, the one who did not commit, right? The fornication, the porneia, the sexual immorality. In the light of this deception, Jesus would be nearer to the school of Shammai than he would have been the school of Hillel. Okay? And Hillel, though, was the popular one. Now, every nation has recognized divorce on one ground or another, right? Rules of states and of churches and the judgment of preachers on divorce may often be different from those stated by Jesus. For example, in rabbinic teaching and Muslim societies, barrenness on the part of a woman is a legitimate cause for divorce. So you marry your wife and you're looking to have children, but she can't give you children. You can put her away and go and remarry someone else. That doesn't sound fair. We're going to make this a matter of fairness, right? Jesus admitted sexual immorality as the only cause. According to Jesus, if one divorces one's spouse on some other grounds than sexual immorality, he or she cannot enter into a subsequent marriage without being guilty of committing adultery. Now, we're not saying here that the injured spouse is obligated, right, to divorce their spouse. I mean, I know of some people that have been through, I promise, I've counseled some, and I've had close friends who, in their marriage, have had to deal with infidelity. One spouse had a relationship of a sexual nature with someone else. It's found out, and then they come back to the table, and they both have to work on that, and there's counseling. There's a lot that goes into that, but they decide they're going to work it out, and that's part. God, this is not saying, if you find that your spouse has committed adultery, you must divorce her and you must marry someone else. That's not what this is saying. It is saying, though, if your spouse does commit adultery, has a relationship with another person, then you can terminate that relationship and you can then marry another. Now, I'll just move through these very quickly. Here you go, verse 10, the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. What do we mean? This right here is kind of unique to Matthew's account. And I believe the disciples' reply here underscores the stringent, even shocking nature of Jesus' teaching in verse 9. I think that's what's clear. Their response seems to indicate some reluctance on their part to give up the attitude of the majority of the Jews on the matter of divorce. If there is no way to get out of a bad marriage and enter into perhaps a better one except by sexual immorality, then it would probably be better to remain single. That's interesting. At least as they're viewing it. And Jesus has got a response to that. And I do think Jesus is responding when he says this saying Some have said that what Jesus is responding to is what he said in verse 9, that not everybody can receive his saying about what he stipulated relative to divorce, marriage, remarriage. I don't think that's it at all. He's responding to the saying that the disciples gave. You know, they said it'd be better if a man didn't marry. And what does Jesus say? Not everybody can go there. In fact, the majority of people are prepared for marriage and are going to look to get married, right? So he says, not everybody's going to be, that's just not going to be an option for most people. So he sort of itemizes some of those that probably could abide by this no marriage vow or whatever, right? So he says there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. We're talking a birth defect that prevents them from entering into a sexual relationship. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. There's some eunuchs you can read about in the Old Testament, right? Then the harems, we're going to castrate you, and that way you can be around the women and take care of them, put their makeup on them and stuff, whatever. And then there are eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This is where it appears as if we're moving from more literal, to a more figurative thing, that these are folks, by virtue of their life in the kingdom, right, have decided that it would be better to be unmarried in order to sort of maximize their potential in the kingdom of God. And here you can segue over to 1 Corinthians 7 and discuss some of Paul's reasoning with the Corinthians on this point. Okay? So let the one who is able to receive this receive it. Okay? But not everybody can receive that. In fact, the majority of humanity cannot receive what you just said, disciples. The majority of humanity is going to desire to be married. They're going to be looking for their helpmate. And this is where things get kind of emotional. So I want to introduce some levity here, if I might. After what the ring cost, it better be. Right? When you say that when most people go into marriage, that if their vows meant anything at all, don't you think that most people go into marriage with the idea of permanence, that this is going to last forever, that we're going to do this till death parts us? I'd like to think, right, that most people on their wedding day, when they make that vow, are committing themselves to God's intention for that marriage. That this isn't getting unwound until one of us is dead, right? Nevertheless, even though that might be what folks profess at their wedding, the statistics show us that that's not what's playing out in practice, right? And folks are ending their marriages for this or that reason. Here's another international symbol of marriage. This is a common brand of marriage humor that exists the world over. Marriage is pictured, right, as a restrictive force in a man's life. The husband receives a few nudges from his friends near his wedding day. Oh, you're going to strap on the old ball and chain, right? Let's just pause here. We might laugh at that. Maybe we've even offered that as a joke, but I hope we're not being serious, right? Men, are you in here been married to your wives? Yeah. If in my more honest moments, I would refer to her as my ball and chain, right? I hope not. This is the kind of humor we got. In many social circles, marriage is often represented as a form of imprisonment or confinement, for the man especially. As if the concept of one man and one woman for life is archaic and no longer relevant. I'd argue that most of us who accept the principle of one man and one woman for life are simply seeking to honor God's design. Another international symbol for marriage. Y'all heard this? Happy wife, happy life, right? So basically, in this situation, he brings home the bacon, she eats all the bacon. He is the puppet, she is the puppet master. He is the slave, she is the queen. He is the king of the world outside of the home. He is anything but the king inside of the home. Put all this another way, he wears the dress, she wears the pants. Y'all ever said that about somebody? Some of you have, probably, you know. Oftentimes the husband uses this brand of humor around his friends, you know, characterizing his wife in this way or that, when such is actually not the case. I will say this situation does exist in some homes. Maybe the question is, should it? Right? Is this what it should look like? I'm not even sure it should look the other way around. After 65 years together, there's nothing left to smile about. Right? This is yet another conception of marriage that is predominant in the minds of many, which in turn becomes the subject of much humor. Indeed, for many people, getting married and staying married for a long period of time is not something that exists on the road to happiness. It's what many people have concluded. You should expect frowns, even scowls, right? And certainly not smiles when your hair turns gray and you find yourself looking at the same person you've been looking at for the last 65 years. To some people, a couple's wedding should be viewed as the funeral service. And the 65th anniversary should be viewed as the internment. Neither should be really a cause for celebration, and everything in between is clearly not worth the effort. I mean, this is our society. Our society has infiltrated the church's thinking about marriage more than we might be comfortable admitting. Now, here's the thing. While we are quite adept at appreciating, even creating such humor, we need to understand that God takes this marriage relationship extremely seriously. My evidence, for this is going back to the beginning. I take you once again to what Jesus said in Matthew 19, 4 through 6. He's presented with an issue concerning this very volatile subject matter, okay? And what does he do? He just marches us right back to the beginning and forces us to stare at God's original intention for marriage. Jesus wasn't the only one that did this. Paul did it. When he was discussing about husbands, remember, love your wives. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And then, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we're members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What did Paul just do there? He just went back to the beginning. And he goes back there and he says, guys, in your marriage, you leave your parental home, you cleave exclusively to your mate, and the two create a new unity. Indeed, the holy, intimate relationship referred to as one flesh. Man and woman, they become one in marriage, not only through their sexual union, but also through their personal and spiritual relationship between one another and the God who created them in the first place. And by his marriage, a man establishes a new family and thus no longer considers himself primarily a member of his parents' family. Now, verse 32 to me is obviously interesting. Paul goes through this love for the wife and comparing it to Christ's love for the church and so forth and so on. And then he says this mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Through the Spirit's revelation, Paul is able to see and reveal a hidden purpose in the institution of the marriage relationship. God ordained the relationship. You remember this, when he brought the man, Adam, and he brought Eve the woman, and he brought them together in that first, marriage, as it were. When he did that, it was to serve as a preview of the fellowship to be shared by Christ and His church. There is a remarkable parallel between the husband and wife and the Christ church relationships, and we learn much about one by studying the other. So while this passage is to be applied to husbands and wives, Paul arguably wants the primary application to be with Christ and His church. That's deep, spiritual, fascinating stuff right there. Let me ask you a question. Do you want Christ to be divorced from the church? Do you want to have a headless body? What do y'all think about a headless body? It's gross. I know it's getting close to like Halloween, and people like headless bodies around Halloween. But do we want a headless body? Do we want a bodiless head? We don't. We'd like to have unity, right? We'd like to have this be together. And what God wants for Christ in the church, He wants between a husband and a wife. Now, I think this is true, and I think you'll agree with it. To understand the beauty and sanctity of marriage as demonstrated by the first human couple at the beginning is to comprehend the calamity of an unhappy marriage and the tragedy of divorce. Right? To go back to the beginning and to see the beauty and the sanctity and the holiness and all that transpired there between Adam and Eve that would foreshadow what's to happen between men and women from henceforth, ultimately sort of previewing Christ in the church, okay? And to understand all of that is to also begin to understand why the breakdown of a marriage relationship is so tragic. God says, Malachi reported, God hates divorce. Is there anybody here that wonders why? I don't know of anybody that's gone through a divorce that says, you know what, I love this experience. This was just great. I hope to do this again and again and again and again and again. It is wonderful. It doesn't hurt at all, right? No, I think anybody that's had to go through divorce, if you're here and you had to go through a divorce, I think you understand why God hates divorce. You're not sitting there scratching your head like, why does He hate this so much? It's pretty easy to get at for all kinds of reasons. Some of them very personal and even experiential. D.A. Carson rightly observed, in every marriage between a man and a woman is a reenactment of and testimony to the very structure of humanity as God created it. So when a marriage ends, something cataclysmic occurs. Now, does God want all marriages to last? His intentional will for marriage is that every marriage that He sanctifies, every person He makes one flesh, He wants them to stay one flesh until death parts them or He comes again. That's what He wants. That's what He desires. But you know that in this fallen world, divorce happens. Even among Christians. The divorce may occur for a variety of reasons. Right? Some of those are going to be superficial. Let's just face it. Are there some people that divorce their spouse and the reason they give is just, it's terrible? Like, some people divorce their spouse. He just wasn't bringing enough bacon home. Had he been bringing some more bacon home, we might have stayed together. In fact, come to think of it, I married the guy because I liked his money. And then when he didn't have the money, I didn't like him so much anymore. So I got divorced. I'm now on my third or fourth marriage, but whatever. We see that. But some of the reasons people get divorced are quite significant, right? I call them the 4 A's. Abuse, addiction, abandonment, adultery. Now, as a preacher, and based on my understanding of Matthew 19:9, marriage to another eligible person is only allowed for the injured party. We may call them the innocent party, in those cases where sexual immorality, adultery, is the grounds for the divorce. Thus, while one could divorce his or her spouse on the grounds of abuse or abandonment or addiction, he or she would not be free to remarry as a result. Now, here's the thing. You go, I don't like that. I don't know. This is probably where the question, why is God so strict on this? He's going to allow for this, but these others, I know in our mind, we go, these others seem just as significant, right? Abuse is terrible. It is. Abandonment is terrible. Addiction. Have y'all seen what addiction does to somebody? And what it can do to all of their relationships? It's terrible. But I can't get up here and Jesus doesn't offer any explicit reasons why the only exception he gave was adultery. And as I mentioned earlier, he could have, with all the authority he's got, he could have not given any exception at all. It could have just been, this is it. And I realize that most of us, we push back and we go, well, that just seems unfair, right? It seems so unfair. But please understand that is it not true that some actions in this life have certain undesirable consequences? Do you think it was fair that when Moses struck the rock, rather than speaking to it, that he didn't get to go into the promised land? You know? See, we're not talking about can a divorced person get into heaven, right? What we're talking about is can a divorced person, other than for purposes of sexual immorality, get into another marriage? And there are just all kinds of things we see in Scripture, consequences that people had to endure as a result of something that occurred in their life, whether it be something they did, perhaps something that somebody did to them, and so forth and so on. What I want to do is I want to close with just this right here. I'm just calling these central concerns, and I got 3 questions for you, and you can take these and you can think about them. I'm going to give you my 2 cents for whatever that's worth. But here's the first question: should we offer mercy in the face of mystery? Let me explain. What I'm saying here is, I've been confronted with cases that just break my heart. And I would say you have too. Where I'm looking at Matthew 19:9, and we may ask, let's frame the question this way. We may wonder why God permits divorce and remarriage in the case of adultery or sexual immorality, but not in cases of abuse or addiction or something that we might conceive. We may wonder that. And here's the thing, whatever I may say in response cannot be specifically gleaned from Scripture. All I got is what He said and what we've got as far as God's intention for marriage from the very beginning. And I would argue that security can only be assured in harmony with what God has revealed. So if I as a preacher, you come to me and say, hey, I'm looking to get married, I just want you to know that my first relationship ended because my husband, got to taking pills. To the best of my knowledge, I have no knowledge. In fact, I don't believe, I'm confident he didn't cheat on me. I just think that, we just couldn't make it work out. And I'd like to know if I can get into another marriage, and start a new relationship. Based on what we've looked at tonight, I couldn't in good conscience say, yeah, go ahead. Because I think that would be highly presumptuous of me. I would be presuming that God's okay with something when all I've got from Jesus, the lips of Jesus Himself, is that when it comes to this divorce and remarriage, I'm only going to allow that. I'm only going to allow you to unone what God has won and enter into another one-flesh relationship if sexual immorality is the reason for that. That's what I got to go on. So that you'll see what I'm saying. Should I say, yeah, go ahead. God doesn't care. It'd be all right. He's a gracious God. I know what He said, but we're just going to act like He didn't say it. can't do that. I just can't. What about this? Should we expect change without conviction? What do you do with cases where people are contemplating getting remarried, or maybe they're in a marriage that maybe they should have never got into in the first place? Okay, what do? Do you understand this? Nobody's changing anything unless they're first convicted themselves, personally, that they're going to change this. So what's the place? What do you do going forward? This is what I've done. I've sat down and I'm open book. I will show them all of the things that people say about this. You know, you get some books say, here are the 8 views on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We'll walk through them. I'll let them read stuff on this. And what I do with them is I counsel them. What I'm saying is they are not changing a thing until they themselves are personally convicted that they need to do so. So what have I got to do in order to help them make a genuine decision relative to this issue? I can't make them do what I think they should do, because they're not going to do that. Y'all see what I'm saying? I mean, you gotta talk, and you gotta hash out this argument, that argument, and they need to be confronted with, but that's illogical, that's actually unbiblical, and they've got to come to a place where they themselves are convicted. This is what you're saying I need to do. I'm convicted that that's what I must do. And here's the last one. Should we stay silent in the face of sorrow or remain reticent in the face of rage? The way that some people talk about this subject, their argument would basically be this: hey man, if somebody ignorantly got into a marriage they shouldn't have got into, it's fine. And frankly, maybe the best way forward is just ignorance. Let's just keep everybody ignorant about this, and that can justify every bad marriage, or every marriage that's illicit in God's eyes. Is anybody comfortable with that? Do you think any doctrine that has us stopping our mouths, not preaching what God's intention for marriage is the way forward? Y'all understand what I'm saying here? The way that some people look at this is, hey, maybe the best thing to do is just, ignorance is bliss, man. Just let them go out there and get in marriages that they shouldn't get into. And as long as they just do it, sincerely but ignorantly, they can stay in that marriage. And let's just keep people ignorant on this, and that way they can cry ignorance, when it's all said and done, and everybody can just go on with their lives. But as preachers, I don't think that that's the way forward. Here's the question. Who's going to stand up and fight for what God desires relative to marriage if the church's preachers don't stand up and fight for what God wants for marriage? Nobody is. Nobody is. I promise you that. Nobody's going to stand up and say, you know what, if we go back to the beginning, this is what God desired. This is what God wanted. And if we don't stand up, then couple after couple, home after home, church after church, city after city, country after country will suffer for it. Frankly, we already are. So that's what I got to say about that. I know it's an emotional subject. I know it's difficult, but I've at least maybe given you some things to think about relative to this, trying to underscore why God is so serious about it. Thanks for your attention this whole entire evening of going on roughly 3 hours and 20 minutes. All right? Is there somebody that's supposed to come up and... You coming, Jesse? All right, man. I'm done.
All right, closing.